without any further ado, let me introduce Dr. Naik. Let's give it up for Dr. Naik.
Thank you so much. So my talk today is going to be on how to communicate with your doctor about being vegan. Now, I use the term vegan. If you are plant-based for your health or for the environment, this would, of course, still pertain to you. So I don't have any conflicts of interest, but I do want to mention that I am on the advisory committee for the Plant-Based Network, which is a new internet TV station. It's also available on Roku, and I do have a show in development with them. I do have a couple disclaimers. The first one is that, yes, I am a doctor, but I am not your doctor. So please do not take anything that we talk about today to be considered medical advice from me to you. And then finally, the opinions that I discuss today are mine and my own, not those of my employer. I'd like to start with a case. This is not a real case, it's a hypothetical case, but it's based on a lot of things that vegans have talked about when they discuss their frustrations with the medical community. So this is a 45-year-old African-American female, and she comes to the doctor complaining of fatigue. Workup reveals that the patient is anemic and has a vitamin D deficiency. As part of the further workup, it turns out that the patient has a mixed pattern of anemia, both vitamin B12 and iron deficiency. So her PCP suggests supplementation for the B12 and the D, and for the iron, she would like her to increase her lean protein intake and what she calls good sources of iron through animal products. So in this situation, what should this patient do? And I'm going to give you a couple choices, and feel free to raise your hand if one of these is something that you think the patient should do. So she should follow her doctor's advice. Veganism is not about risking one's life, it's about being practical. She absolutely needs to leave this doctor. They don't know what they're doing. She shouldn't just leave the doctor, she needs to file a complaint against the doctor. So how many takers for A? Okay, how many for B? Okay, and how many for C? Okay, good, nobody hates the doctor. All right, so my answer to this is actually D, none of the above. And I hope that as we go through this talk, you'll understand why I think that. So I want to start with explaining a little bit about your doctor's background. I think there's a lot of misinformation about how doctors are trained and how we practice. And both of these things combined directly relate to why we counsel patients the way that we do. So if your doctor does primary care, they're a family practice doctor, an internal medicine doctor, a pediatrician. They've been in school for between 23 and 24 years. So 12 years of regular school, 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, and then 3 to 4 years of residency after that. After they do that, they can do further training. So they can do 1-year fellowships. They can do further subspecialty training like I did. After that, they can do even more training like I did. And then after that, they have to decide what type of practice are they going to go into. Are they going to do a hospital-based practice? Are they going to be in a private practice? Will they see patients only in the clinic? Or will they also see patients in the hospital? The main thing that changes from my perspective when you go from being a trainee to being what we call an attending physician or somebody who's independently practicing, there's two main things that change. The first one is how much time do we actually get with our patients? And the second one is how much time do we now spend doing non-clinical things? And I'm actually going to show you some data on that. So how much face-to-face time is your primary care doctor getting? I struggled to find newer studies on this, but what I could find was anywhere from 10 to 17 minutes is the average primary care visit. Now, I was able to find some indirect information on this. So this next slide is very busy. You don't need to worry about what this is other than to know that this was a study that looked at consultation times all over the world for physicians. The second bar down is the USA. So despite the fact that that's only somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes, we're still doing better than most of the world when it comes to the amount of time a doctor gets to do consults. Another indirect measure of time is when you look at how physicians practice and what the breakdown of their day is. So in 2017, they did a study, and they found that for every 2 hours a patient spends on a computer, a doctor spends on a computer, they're spending about an hour with their patients. What this actually works out to is about an 11.5-hour day. So if you're a clinic doctor, your clinic's actually only 8 hours. So that's another 3.5 hours that you're spending on top of your clinic. And the breakdown of that is about 4.5 hours in clinic on the computer, another 1.5 hours after clinic is over, another 2.5 hours after that to do things like order entry and billing and documentation, and then another 85 minutes to deal with your inbox. So your inbox is where your patients are emailing you, where you're getting results, where other staff are messaging you, and these numbers are pretty much how I spend my day. So this next slide I'm just going to go through very quickly. This is essentially more studies showing that essentially we spend more time not seeing patients than we do actually in front of a patient. And what are PCPs addressing during these visits? Well, again, depending on the study, anywhere from 3 to 7 major issues at every visit, again, which is averaging about 17 minutes. So that's headaches, hypertension, dyslipidemia, high cholesterol, back pain, depression, fibromyalgia. That doesn't include acute issues like a cough that I've had for 2 weeks or a sprained ankle. Well, how much time do you actually need? Is 17 minutes enough time? Well, to give you an example, there's an organization called the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, and this is a nonpartisan government organization that sets guidelines for how we decide who needs to be screened for what. For example, they make recommendations based on the evidence for who needs to be screened for lung cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, but they also make recommendations on smoking cessation, physical activity, that kind of thing. And this group did a really cool study. What they did is, they looked at how long it would take the average doctor to adequately counsel patients just on preventative care, so just on the things the USPSTF recommends doctors counsel their patients on. And that turns out to be about 1,800 hours a year. Okay, well, great. What does that actually mean in a day? Would it surprise you to know it's about 7.5 hours out of a day to properly counsel patients? And again, your clinic is 8 hours long. How much time do I spend on nutrition? Well, in a perfect world, if I have all the time I want to really talk to patients, I'm spending 20 to 30 minutes with them. Now, that's not realistic, right? Because I don't have 20 to 30 minutes with them. But it often takes me 10 minutes to get a patient to stop looking at me like I'm crazy because I tell them that broccoli can fix their diabetes. So remember, my patients are not actually coming to see me for nutrition. They're coming to see me for lung issues. So it's very challenging in my practice to do that. Now, if you're a primary care doctor and you're dealing with 5 to 7 medical issues that you need to address at every visit, it's still going to be challenging to do nutrition education. Well, how much are PCPs actually doing? How much counseling are they doing? Well, this study looked at physical activity, nutrition, and smoking cessation. And they found that about 50% of doctors actually are addressing physical activity and nutrition. But they're spending less than a minute on physical activity and just over a minute on nutrition. All three combined, they're spending a little over 10% of time. So what are the factors that influence the amount of time that these folks spent? Well, as you can imagine, if you have a visit that happens to be longer than 20 minutes because your last patient canceled or you got done with your other patient sooner, you obviously have more time to spend on nutrition with your next patient. If your doctor actually is supportive of the idea of lifestyle modification, not just because they believe it works, but they believe you will follow it, then patients are more likely to get information. And then as you can imagine, if you have 8 issues to discuss in a visit, your doctor doesn't have much time to discuss nutrition, which is ironic because nutrition could probably fix many of those 8 issues. So if you've done the math on this, that means your average primary care doctor is seeing about 100 patients a week. They have multiple disease processes. They are seeing patients for between 15 to 20 minutes. So if you leave this talk and you don't remember anything that we talk about, I hope you leave with this one concept. And that is that your primary care doctor gets very little time to see patients and certainly not enough to do primary prevention, let alone nutrition counseling. So before we get back to case number 1, I'm going to do another case. And this is a real case. This is a friend of mine who is in family practice in North Carolina, and this is a patient that she saw. So it's a 45-year-old patient as well. She's a brand new patient to my friend, but she comes to her with the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia, so high cholesterol. Now, her diabetes and her blood pressure are under okay control. They still need a little bit of work, But my friend spends almost no time on these two issues because her 20-minute new patient visit changes into a 45-minute visit because of this. The patient's total cholesterol is 310 and her LDL is 190. Now, she is untreated for cholesterol despite knowing that this is her diagnosis. And the reason for that is that the patient has been on multiple different classes of medications for cholesterol in the past and has had side effects to them. They were not side effects that were severe enough that as a physician, we would recommend stopping those medications. However, the patient of her own accord felt uncomfortable and decided to stop the medications. So the patient is very irate at this point. And when she sees my friend, she demands to know, what are you going to do to lower my cholesterol? I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to that. So because she's tried multiple other classes of medications, and because this is really the only class of drug that's left, my friend recommends a PCSK9 inhibitor. As an FYI, this medication costs between $30,000 and $40,000 a year, depending on your insurance coverage. That is not why my friend is recommending it. She's recommending it because the patient refuses to try the other classes again. So the patient gets really upset, absolutely refuses, says that my friend is doing this to push drugs on her because she gets a kickback. So I have an asterisk here because I want to take 2 seconds to explain that's not a thing. Doctors do not get kickbacks for the amount of drugs that we prescribe or what drugs we prescribe. The vast majority of physicians work in a hospital-employed practice. I have no control over what my institution decides to negotiate with drug companies for what drugs are available. I often don't know which drugs are going to be covered by that person's particular insurance company. So I'm making the best recommendation for a medication based on their disease, not based on their coverage. So going back to the patient, she wants to know, why won't you prescribe me something that doesn't have to do with pills? So my friend, who happens to eat a predominantly plant-based diet, says, this is great. I'm really glad you want to do this. We can absolutely do something more holistic. However, your cholesterol level currently is too dangerous to only do behavior modification. So let's get you on some medication. We'll make the behavior modification, and then we'll wean you off the medication. The behavior modification that's going to work best for you is going to be a plant-based diet. It'll happily also help your diabetes and your high blood pressure. So this is great, right? This is exactly what we want to see. A patient comes in with a medical issue that is influenced by diet predominantly. They're offered a pill, they don't want the pill, the doctor recommends a non-pill alternative. So this is great news, right? The patient goes home, they make the behavior modification, they come off the medicine, and everyone lives happily ever after. Except, this is what the patient said. I'm really not ready to give up meat and cheese, I guess I'll just take the medicine. So I do not bring this up in an attempt to shame this patient or to judge the patient. It is obviously easier to take a pill once a day or once a month or once a week, depending on what the medication is, as opposed to making a lifestyle change. So this is not meant as a judgment of the patient, but this is what doctors deal with every single day. So the point in my saying this is that most doctors have very little time to see their patients. They're dealing with multiple issues, and when they do attempt to discuss nutrition and diet, they're often met with unwillingness. So you can understand why, if you've only got 20 minutes to talk to your patient, you're going to go for what you think is going to have the most success with your patient. But is physician perception correct? So they did a small study in 2015, and they asked patients and staff their opinions on plant-based diets as it pertains to type 2 diabetes. And what they found was that 72% of doctors were aware of the benefits of a plant-based diet, which I think is pretty remarkable. If they had done this study in 2005, I don't think we'd see these kind of numbers. But only a third of them were willing to recommend a plant-based diet. So why is that? The top 3 reasons given were they felt the eating pattern was not realistic and would be difficult to adhere to. They felt patients would not accept this message. And finally, they felt that there are no clear clinical practice guidelines in diet-specific education. And I see this a lot. I have cardiologists recommend that patients follow up with me for nutrition counseling because although they are recommending plant-based diets to their patients, when their patients come back to them with questions, they're unclear where they should point the patient to. They don't know what's out there for patients for support. So are healthcare workers right? Are patients not going to accept this message? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. So what this study showed is, if you look at the light gray bars, these are existing patients in this clinical practice. 66% of them, so 2/3 of them, were aware of the benefits of a plant-based diet. Again, a number I don't think we would have seen 10 years ago. 65% of them were actually willing to make a change. Here's the big caveat. This study did not ask, are you willing to go plant-based to fix or control your type 2 diabetes? They were simply asked, would you consider going plant-based for 3 weeks? So the important part of this is, yes, that the message is getting out there. We just need some follow-up studies to see, are patients actually doing it? And if they're doing it, are they sticking with it? Because of course, if you do something for 3 weeks, you'll absolutely see benefit. But if you go back to eating the way you were eating before, those benefits go away. So I'm going to do 2 more slides before we get back to case number 1. And these also speak to some of the misinformation I think that's out there, not just in the vegan community, but just in the lay person community in general about physicians. I cannot emphasize enough to you, doctors are not in the business of keeping us sick. Now, that's not to say that the system of medicine we practice in is not a system of medicine that favors being sick versus being preventative. But doctors don't go into medicine because they want sick patients. If you're a primary care doctor, you definitely didn't go into medicine because you want to take care of patients that have 5 and 6 and 7 medical problems. I went into critical care because I really enjoy taking care of people who are critically ill. I don't want them to be critically ill, but I enjoy the challenge of taking care of them. If you're in primary care, you want your patients to be doing well. You want to be able to focus those 7.5 hours on preventative care. So remember I told you in case number 2, the patient demanded of my friend, what are you going to do to lower my cholesterol? It's really important to understand that your doctor cannot be more invested in your health than you are. So we often see this, and this is not just something that patients seem to perceive. Doctors perceive medicine this way too. We kind of look at it as a patient comes in with a medical problem, it needs to be fixed, the doctor fixes it. Well, that model really only works in an ICU, right? When a patient's intubated, they're in septic shock, they have no control over what's going on with them, their physicians and their nurses are controlling their care. But if you come in with a medical problem to clinic, you really need to be empowered to make the changes, right? So one of the things I tell my patients routinely is I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is you're in control of your health. The bad news is only you are in control of your health. So I can make all the recommendations I want to you, but if you don't pick up that baton and run with it, we won't see change. This doesn't just pertain to nutrition, of course. This pertains to everything: smoking cessation, activity, sleep hygiene, everything. We all know in this room that doctors do not get much education on nutrition. Unfortunately, we have somehow extrapolated that to a general mistrust of what physicians know. So I spent 27.5 years in training. In that time, I learned how to take care of patients in an ICU, on a floor, in an urgent care, on an OB ward, in an OR. I learned how to look at blood smears under a microscope, how to look at urine samples under a microscope, how to order CT scans and read them, how to know when someone needs a CT scan versus an MRI. And I also learned how to critically appraise the literature. Now, I'm just giving you a rundown of some of the things I've learned, right? So my point here is that it's really not a legitimate extrapolation to say that because doctors don't know anything about nutrition that we haven't learned about other aspects of medicine. And that's just really important to understand if you're trying to build a trusting relationship with your physician. All right, so let's finally get back to the patient in case number 1. So if you recall, this is the patient who was diagnosed with anemia. She was told to take a B12 supplement and a vitamin D supplement, but for her iron deficiency, the patient was recommended to increase her meat intake. So what should this patient do? Well, you won't remember this from the slide, but nowhere on that slide do I mention that the patient is vegan. And I did that deliberately. Because in all likelihood, your doctor has no idea that you're vegan. They're not going to remember it. Remember, they're seeing 100 patients a week. Even if they do know you're vegan, they have no idea what that means. And you can't really blame them, right? The media portrays veganism as if it's a trend like keto or paleo. It's just a hat that you can stop wearing when it's inconvenient. Most people don't understand that veganism is an ethical stance and that it's about animal rights. Now, if you eat a plant-based diet for your health or for the environment, these are still deeply held beliefs, right? And a lot of doctors don't necessarily understand that these are not things that you're willing to forego. So let your doctor know, hey doc, I'm vegan, or I'm plant-based, and what that actually means. So I'm going to give you a little anecdote. I was diagnosed with vitamin D deficiency earlier this year. I'm a person of color. I'm always in the hospital. I'm never in the sun. It's pretty common. My doctor prescribed a vitamin D supplement to me, and it happened to be a non-vegan supplement. I did not get upset. I knew she wasn't trying to disrespect my values. I knew she probably just didn't remember I was vegan. I sent her a text, hey, could you just change that prescription to a vegan vitamin D supplement? She texted me back, oh yeah, sorry, I just forgot, no problem, prescription's in. So my point is, communicate with your doctor. Ask them to help you find a vegan alternative to what they're recommending. You can ask for a nutritionist referral. Now, just make sure that the nutritionist is comfortable with plant-based diets and with veganism, but you always have that right. And I would recommend, in the case of patient number 1, if that doctor did not feel comfortable counseling the patient on how to boost her iron stores without supplementation, but through diet, I would say, then you should go see a nutritionist who understands how you can find good sources of iron on a plant-based diet. Now, there are some caveats to this. So there are going to be times that your doctor might recommend something to you that is not vegan, and there may not be a vegan option. So for example, if you're someone who needs tube feeds, there are some vegan options that are very hard to come by, but generally speaking, you're not going to find a lot of vegan options. Medications. There are some vegan medications like vitamin D2, and then there's some things that are not going to be vegan. But let's say you've had a heart attack, and your doctor prescribes something called a beta blocker. This is a life-saving medication after a heart attack. No physician is ever going to feel comfortable saying, I get it, you're vegan, you don't want to take this medicine because it's not vegan. And again, my personal opinion is the spirit of veganism is not about risking one's health. Vaccines. There are no current vegan vaccine options. Now, there are some egg-free preparations, but all vaccines are tested on animals. Now, there are some folks that are working on finding non-animal tested, cruelty-free vaccines, but currently there are no vegan ones. That said, you should still get vaccinated. Please do not spend Q&A time arguing with me about vaccines. I will not be addressing that. Okay. Well, when should you be concerned when you're talking to your doctor? Well, if you ask your doctor to help you find a vegan option and they're unwilling to help you, that's a big red flag. It's really important that you distinguish unwilling to find one and unable to find one. Of course, you always have the right to a second opinion. You do want to make sure that your insurance company covers this, but you always have the right to a second opinion. My personal belief is if your doctor gets offended that you've asked for a second opinion, that is a red flag. So some other things. Remember I said that one of the things I learned about in my training is how to critically appraise the literature? As physicians, we are eager to learn. Time permitting, we want to learn about things that we're not familiar with in the medical world. That said, if a patient comes in and says to me, hey doc, my cousin's friend did this, can I do that? I don't know what that means. I can't trust that because I don't know if the patient interpreted that correctly. I don't actually know if the patient's cousin's friend actually had what they think they had. So in other words, we don't follow case reports or stories, right? We need to follow the body of evidence, okay? So if your doctor seems uncomfortable with plant-based diets, but they seem willing to work with you, just say, hey doc, can I give you some scientific literature? Can I give you some studies so that you can learn about plant-based diets so that we can continue to work together? You just have to make sure they're from reliable sources. So what are some of those sources? Well, the Adventist 1 and 2 trials are great trials. So these are trials that looked at disease processes as they related to various dietary patterns. So everything from the standard American diet all the way to vegetarian, to vegan, to whole foods plant-based. And we'll get back to that in a minute. This is Dean Ornish's website. I really like these 3 particular studies. The Lancet Oncology study on telomeres. So telomeres are the caps on the ends of our chromosomes. As we get older, we've always been taught that they continue to get shorter and shorter and then eventually lead to cell death. We know that many disease processes in the lung world, for example, something called pulmonary fibrosis, actually is sometimes related to abnormal rapid shortening of your telomeres. Well, what this study looked at is going on a plant-based diet. If you've been on a plant-based diet for about a year, you stabilize the length of your telomeres. If you've been on a plant-based diet for 5 years, you can actually see growth in your telomeres. By the way, the senior author on this study was Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of telomerase. So the Lifestyle Heart Study is the first study to ever show that dietary modification can reverse blockages in the heart. The Geminal Study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science is a study that looked at men with prostate cancer, and they found that if they put these guys on plant-based diets for 90 days, they actually changed gene expression. They were able to turn off more than 450 pro-cancer and pro-inflammatory genes and turn on more than 50 anti-cancer and anti-inflammatory genes. So when we say things like it's genetic, that may not be nearly as true as we once thought it was. So this is a very busy slide. The point of this is this study and the one that I'm going to talk about after this are done by the same group. And I like telling my colleagues about these two because together they tell a very important story. So this first study looks at TMAO production in plant-based diets. So TMAO is a really dangerous molecule that we're learning about over the last 5 to 7 years. And essentially, it's one of the first steps to the production of atherosclerosis. So heart disease, stroke, but also limb loss through blockages in arteries and veins. It is also, however, implicated in pathways that lead to things like colorectal cancer. So how do you produce TMAO? Well, you produce it if your gut microbiome is exposed to carnitine and choline. Carnitine is only found in animal products and some energy drinks. Choline is found in everything. We all need a little bit of choline in our diet. Unlike what recent media reports have said, we probably all get enough choline if we're eating properly varied plant-based diets. When you eat choline from animal sources, you're probably getting too much choline. Well, what this group looked at is they compared plant-based eaters and people who ate animal products, and then they gave them carnitine to see if these guys could produce TMAO. And if you look at the bottom lines, those are what they're calling the vegans. These guys could not produce TMAO when they were given carnitine, which again only comes from animal products. However, if you ate animal products on a regular basis, your TMAO levels go through the roof very quickly. So remember I told you there's two parts to that story. The second part is a lot of times patients will come to me and they'll go, you know, doc, I only eat a steak once in a while. Why is that bad? You know, what's wrong with a little bit of deer meat? From an ethical standpoint, I'd say there's a lot wrong with taking the life of an animal when it's not necessary. However, as a physician, I'm not there to talk to them about ethics. I'm there to talk to them about science. And the science clearly says that if you are eating repeated amounts of animal products, you can still produce TMAO. That's what this study showed. So what they did is they took these same folks who were plant-based eaters and they said, what happens if we start giving them repeated doses of carnitine? And now, all of a sudden, they're able to produce TMAO because their gut microbiome switches back. Now, there's another study that I haven't posted up here that you can find on my Instagram that looks at when you eat a heavy animal-based diet like the paleo diet or a pseudo-paleo diet, you actually upregulate 3 key bacteria that are implicated in things like inflammatory bowel disease. So there's multiple reasons that we shouldn't be eating animal products periodically. So going back to some websites that I think are reasonable to recommend to your doctor, PCRM, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, I like recommending this to my colleagues because not only do they get to learn about plant-based diets, but they get to get credit for it because they can get something called CME, which we all need as physicians. The lifestylemedicine.org website, this is the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, I routinely recommend this, and I've had a couple weird things happen recently where, I recommend this to everybody that I meet, so I never remember who I've recommended it to, but I've had a couple people in the last 6 months email me back and say, you recommended this website to me last year, I'm learning more about this, and now I'm actually going to go look into getting board certified in lifestyle medicine. So I like recommending this because not only can I get doctors to think about it, but I might even be able to get them over from the dark side. All right, so nutritionstudies.org is the T. Colin Campbell study group, so I love that one as well. And then I really like the Kaiser Nutrition Update. So this is a 4-page document. It's really easy to print out. There is one caveat to this. They recommend low-fat dairy products. So when I hand this to doctors or to patients, I explain to them that the studies suggesting that dairy is incredibly unhealthy for us and is frankly dangerous far outweigh the very small, not very robust studies that suggest that dairy may be protective. So you just need to kind of mention that if you give this to your doctor. Just as an FYI to folks that don't know this, Kaiser in Atlanta, they actually have free plant-based nutrition classes that are available to anybody in the community, as well as exercise classes, so you can just go to kp.org and sign up for them. This is probably one of my favorite resources. So this is essentially a primer on plant-based nutrition for healthcare professionals. What's really great about this is it actually addresses step-by-step the nutrients that people are commonly concerned about when they recommend plant-based diets to their patients. Okay, so before we wrap up, there's just a couple more things I want to point out. So this is a quote from Kim Williams. He is the former president of the American College of Cardiology and the chief of cardiology at Rush. He is vegan and has been for 20 years. So he once said, "I know I'm going to die, I just don't want it to be my fault." Now, obviously, he meant this facetiously. And I bring this up because I think it's really important for people to understand that being vegan is not a guarantee of being free of disease. It can be a guarantee of decreased risk of disease. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So remember, if you are vegan and you're still struggling with heart disease or diabetes or something like that, it may be related to the fact that your pre-vegan habits are still affecting you. So if you were eating the standard American diet for 45 years and you've been plant-based or vegan for 6 months, first of all, congratulations. But secondly, realize that it takes some time to see some of these changes happen. Some of them happen very quickly, but on a biochemical level, things can take time to change. Remember that study on gut microbiome? They were looking at people who'd been vegan for a year. It's also important to understand when people tell you things like, "Oh, well, I knew this vegan and he was anemic because he was vegan." Well, no, veganism is not a diet, it's an ethical stance. An ethical stance cannot make you anemic, right? However, a bad diet, of course, can make you anemic. So these two studies are really important. So remember we talked about Adventist 1 and 2. One of the things this study very clearly showed is that if you're eating a vegan diet, so devoid of animal products, which is awesome, unfortunately, if it's very high in processed foods, you are still at increased risk of heart attack, type 2 diabetes, and stroke, unlike if you're eating a whole foods plant-based diet. So this next one in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology from just 2 years ago showed essentially the same thing. If you're eating an unhealthy plant-based diet, you have an increased risk of heart disease and stroke versus eating a healthy plant-based diet. Now, please do not misunderstand. There's a lot of delicious vegan junk food here today. This is not intended to be a criticism of things like VegFest. Obviously, people do not come to VegFest to eat fruits and veggies that you can get at the grocery store, right? So my point here is if the bulk of what you're eating is the stuff that you're eating today, that's not going to confer a lot of protection to you. So when I tell my patients, when I tell them to transition to plant-based diets, absolutely. If you want to eat some vegan junk food because it's going to help you get over your cravings for animal products, do it. But if you're still eating a predominantly junk food diet in 6 months, we're having a different conversation. Remember, part of my job as a doctor is to tell patients what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. Okay. So, just to sum up, why is this not moving? Okay. An open line of communication with your doctor about your values is critical to your relationship. This does not just pertain to veganism. This pertains to any issue that you might be having with your doctor. Remember that your doctor probably does not understand that veganism is not a diet or that you are not committed to a plant-based diet. They may not understand that. So it's really important that you clarify that with them and then explain what your concerns are about whatever the treatment is. If you just tell your doctor, "No, I'm not going to do that," they have no understanding of why you're saying that. Ask your doctor to be your partner in your health care, to come up with vegan options. But remember, if there isn't a vegan option, you must be prepared to either choose to do the option anyway, which is frankly what I would recommend, but also if you opt not to do it and your doctor continues to talk to you about it, they're not trying to be a jerk. They're not trying to disrespect your values. They're doing it because part of our job as physicians is to make sure you clearly understand the risk that you incur if you opt out of a treatment. Remember that it's really unlikely that your doctor's recommending non-vegan options out of malice or incompetence. Remember, they're time crunched. They may not realize that you're willing to consider these options. If you recall, your doctor's previous experiences likely suggest that their patients want a prescription and that they're not going to follow a lifestyle change. So you need to be the one that puts your hand up and says, "Hey, doc, I'm in the other line." Okay. If your doctor is amenable, absolutely give them scientific studies or scientific websites. Not only does this increase the chances that they'll read it and trust it, but they're going to have more time if you've just literally done the work for them and handed it to them. Now, it's really important that we go back for a second and talk about scientific websites. There's a tendency in the vegan community to post on social media from just complete, utter nonsense websites that are promoting wellness and things like that that aren't necessarily based in science. And here's the problem with that. If you print out something from an unreliable resource and hand it to your doctor, even if what this website is saying is 1000% true, your doctor will not trust it because they don't trust the source. So make sure that you're giving them information from a reliable source. Okay, Google is not a reliable source of information. All right? I will say that again. Google is not a legitimate source of information. Okay? I'm being very serious here. Okay? Don't print out stuff from Google University because it just does not make sense. The same thing goes for social media. Now, obviously, I'd like to think that my Instagram account is a reliable source of information. So if you're finding it from a plant-based doctor or someone who's board certified in lifestyle medicine, these are reliable sources on social media. Again, you need to make sure that the source that you're handing your doctor or that you yourself are following personally is a reliable source of information. And then finally, please understand that being vegan or plant-based does not mean you will never get sick. But in the right instance, if you are eating a whole foods plant-based diet with minimal or no oil, you are going to have the best chance of having a healthy, long, happy life. Now, this is pertaining to diet. There are other aspects of lifestyle medicine that we did not talk about here. So activity, having good sleep hygiene, making sure that you're not under excessive amounts of stress, making sure that you have a good social support system, making sure that you're not smoking, that you're not drinking to excess. These are all important behaviors. We're only addressing diet today, but it's important to know that your best bet from a dietary perspective of good health is a whole foods, low-fat, plant-based diet with minimal or no oil. All right, that is it.